There now follows a party political broadcast on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Right, well, I don't intend to talk about the COVID-19 crisis, what my colleague in the Home Office calls the global health pandemic, and what the rest of us just call a pandemic. Instead, I want to broaden our discussions and think about what's going to be happening after we've come through this awful disease, when the entire country will be completely bankrupt. We'll have a number of challenges which we'll have to face. And one of these is going to be that we've got about 1.5 million migrant workers, all of whom will have visas about to expire. Now, normally, of course, what we do is just deport all these people back home where they came from. But since quite a few of these people have been looking after your granny, that won't really go down too well with the chattering classes. So that's one problem we'll have to deal with. Another problem is that about 1/3 of the working population will be completely unemployed. So there's two serious problems that we're going to have to deal with. The other problem, of course, is that the country is going to be totally and utterly bankrupt. So we won't have any money for the welfare state. The NHS, of course, we already have sold that off to Mr. Trump and the pharmaceutical companies in America. And so basically about 1/3 of the country is going to be completely destitute. Well, we in the Cabinet have been thinking, well, I say we, I mean Dominic Cummings, of course, but we in the Cabinet have been thinking about this pretty hard. We are all classically educated and we know all about history and the lessons of history. And one of the things we know about history is that every single empire that's ever been, every single empire, including the British Empire, and of course the American Empire and the Chinese Empire that's developing, every single empire has been founded on one single guiding principle, and that is the principle of slavery. So our idea is that we will reinstitute slavery. Now, I know some of you will think this is a bit odd, but actually it's a jolly good idea. First of all, with the migrant workers, we don't really necessarily want to deport. All we do, we just say, well, you just sign up, register as a slave, and you can stay in this country. As for all these chaps on 0-hour contracts and all this sort of thing, who have to go to the food bank in every lunch hour, except they don't get a lunch hour, of course. We would just ask them voluntarily to sign up as slaves, and if they don't want to, then we'll just make them. The slaves, of course, we will make sure they are owned in the first instance by the state. So we'll nationalise the slave market to begin with, until we get it all up and running and all working smoothly. We will then sell the slaves at knockdown prices to their former employers, who will become the new slave owners. And because we'll be selling at knockdown prices, it's a bit like selling off shares in BT or the post office, a kind of incentive to get the whole ball rolling. And so that would be jolly good for the slave owners. Now, the slave owners, in turn, they will be responsible for looking after the slaves. They'll have to provide food and shelter and clothing and look after the slaves' families and that sort of thing. And of course that will incur certain costs. But bear in mind, the slave owners won't actually be paying wages. At least those who used to pay wages won't be paying wages anymore. We might ask them to pay a little bit more in national insurance, but otherwise they'll make huge, ginormous savings in their wage bills. And although they'll have to pay for housing and food and so on, we will centralise all of this, which will mean that they will benefit from the economies of scale. We've done the calculation. We've had chaps in the Treasury, and they have used up pretty well a whole office full of old envelopes and done the calculations. and they reckon that the average slave owner will make really quite a handsome profit out of this. What about the welfare of the slaves themselves? Well, it turns out that we've got legislation already on the books which will take care of most of the problems. Basically, remember that the slaves are going to be assets, and of course the slave owners will want to buy and sell them as we free up the slave market and privatize it. Then of course that means that the slaves themselves will come under the standard legislation regarding sale of goods. So if you try and sell some dodgy slave that got bronchitis or something to someone, then they can just return the slave and ask for a refund. But what about mistreatment? We don't want our slave owners to mistreat the slaves. We don't want dispatchers or panorama journalists or something with hidden cameras and all. We don't want this. And in any case, we in the cabinet, we are all decent, civilized men, apart from Priti Patel, of course. She's barely civilized in any respect, and certainly not as far as slavery is concerned. But the rest of us are all pretty civilized, and we actually don't want to see our slaves mistreated. So again, it turns out we've got the legislation, for the most part, on the books. We've already got legislation. For example, if the RSPCA, if they go and raid some dodgy donkey sanctuary or something, they've got all sorts of laws that they can invoke to take this dodgy donkey sanctuary to court. So all we have to do is take that legislation, cross out the word donkey, write the word slave, and Bob's your uncle. Basically, we've got pretty well everything sorted out already. Now, obviously, with that sort of animal welfare legislation, we have to take things a bit gradually. Under the present animal welfare legislation, actually, if the RSPCA were to raid, a shop floor or something, and they discovered that some poor slave had to give birth in a factory laboratory, then they'd probably be forced to close the place down. And obviously, we don't want that. The slave owners would be up in arms about that. So we'll have to introduce this sort of animal welfare legislation for slaves piecemeal, bit by bit. But that shouldn't be a problem. And by the time we privatise all this and sell the slave market to reputable companies like, Capita or Serco or something, we should have a pretty decent system in place. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking this is just some kind of joke, some bloke with his iPhone making a YouTube video and some sort of Jonathan Swift-style modest proposal kind of nonsense. But I urge you to think about this a bit harder. If we introduced our benign slavery, say 5 years ago, then millions of people on these god-awful contracts would have been better off, according to our calculations. That's just 5 years ago, before all the Brexit nonsense and the COVID. Just imagine what it's going to be like this time next year, when the whole country is totally buggered economically and about 7.5 million people are completely destitute. This is a jolly good idea, and since we've got a thumping, huge majority, we're going to do it anyway. So there you are. Thank you.